All right, let's do this. You ready to dive into some serious heresy?
Always up for a trip into the grim darkness.
That's what I like to hear. Today we're going deep, really deep into heresy in the Warhammer 40K universe. We've got some excerpts from the 40K fandom wiki on heresy, and man, this stuff is intense.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Yeah, it does. It's like this dark, twisted mirror of our own history, but like cranked up to 11.
To a terrifying extreme for sure.
So imagine this, right? You're a citizen in the Imperium, this galaxy-spanning empire ruled by a god emperor.
Doesn't sound too bad on the surface.
Right, like pretty straightforward, worship the emperor, follow the rules. But here's the thing, what happens when your faith wavers?
Oh, that's where things get dicey.
Or like your interpretation of the imperial creed is a little different than the guy next to you.
That's the crux of it. It's not just about outward acts of rebellion. It's about thought control.
Whoa, seriously. So we're not just talking about worshiping chaos gods or siding with some alien overlord.
Not just that. Heresy in 40K goes way deeper. We're talking absolute obedience to the emperor and the imperial truth.
So even questioning certain practices could be considered heresy.
Anything that challenges the established dogma, even a whisper of doubt, can get you branded a heretic.
That's wild. No wonder everyone in the Imperium is so paranoid.
Can you blame them?
But wait, doesn't that create a kind of paradox? I mean, the Imperium needs the Space Marines and the Adeptus Mechanicus, right?
Right.
But they don't exactly follow the Imperial cult to the letter.
That's where things get really interesting. You've got the Space Marines, superhuman, loyal to the Emperor. But do they worship him as a god?
Good point.
They revere him, sure, but not necessarily as a deity. More like the pinnacle of humanity, the ultimate leader.
And what about the Adeptus Mechanicus with their machine god? Talk about walking a tightrope.
Exactly. Their relationship with the Emperor and the Imperial cult is complex, to say the least. They've got the machine god, this separate entity, but some believe it's a manifestation of the Emperor himself.
Whoa, that's a whole other level of theological debate.
A gray area that the Imperium tolerates, mostly because they desperately need the Adeptus Mechanicus and their tech.
Right, can't maintain that vast empire without a bit of tech
But
savvy.
it's all about balance, or at least the appearance of balance.
Mm.
The Imperium needs power, but it also craves control.
Yeah, and that tension, that's where things get messy.
It's a breeding ground for heresy, because when the lines get blurred, it's easy for dissent to take root.
Okay, so let's say someone gets suspected of heresy. What happens next? Does the Inquisition just show up and start, burning people at the stake?
Oh, it's a bit more complicated, a lot more brutal than that.
I figured as much.
The fandom wiki describes a chillingly efficient process, and it all starts with suspicion.
Suspicion. So anyone could be a suspect.
Precisely. No one is above suspicion in the Imperium, not even the highest-ranking officials.
And the Inquisition, they're the ones in charge of sniffing out heresy, right?
They're the Emperor's most watchful servants, always on the lookout for the slightest deviation from the imperial truth. Paranoia is practically a virtue in their line of work.
So what happens once you're suspected? Do you at least get a fair trial or something?
Fairness isn't exactly high on the priority list in the 41st millennium, especially when it comes to heresy.
Yikes. Sounds rough.
Once you're on their radar, the Inquisition launches an investigation, and let me tell you, they don't mess around. They're all about efficiency and decisive action.
No due process, no chance to plead your case.
Remember, from their perspective, heresy is like a cancer, a disease that must be eradicated no matter the cost. They believe even a tiny spark can ignite a planet-consuming inferno.
That's a pretty intense analogy. So let's say the investigation confirms the heresy. What then? What kind of punishments are we talking about here?
This is where the true horror of heresy in Warhammer 40K comes into play.
Right, I was kind of getting that vibe.
We're not talking about a slap on the wrist here. The 40K universe has some of the most creative and terrifying punishments imaginable.
Lay it on me. What does the Imperium do to its heretics?
Well, for starters, there's excommunicate traitorous. Imagine being completely erased from history, your name wiped from all records, your very existence denied.
Whoa, that's messed up.
And then you become an enemy of the Imperium, hunted across the galaxy by assassins and bounty hunters.
That's not just physical death. It's like the complete annihilation of your identity, your legacy.
And that's just the beginning.
Wait, there's more.
Oh yeah, how about the Edict of Obliteration? It's also known as Damnatio Memoria.
Damnatio Memoria.
It's reserved for individuals or organizations who've committed such heinous acts of heresy that even their memory must be purged.
So not just erased from history, but utterly forgotten, like you never even existed.
Exactly. Your accomplishments, your failures, everything wiped from the collective memory of the Imperium.
That's just chilling. But it gets worse, right?
It does. We have to talk about Exterminatus.
Exterminatus, isn't that like...
The complete and utter annihilation of an entire planet. Yes, it is.
Hold on, they wipe out a whole planet, billions, trillions of lives, gone just like that. That seems a bit extreme, even for the Imperium.
It is extreme, but you have to understand the context.
Yeah.
They're facing threats that could literally extinguish all of humanity.
Right. Demons, warp entities, alien invasions.
Exactly. In that context, Exterminatus becomes a terrifying break-in-case of emergency button, a last resort to stop an existential threat.
So it's not just about punishing heresy, it's about preventing something even worse.
Precisely. Let's say a planet is completely overrun by a chaos cult. Rampant mutation, demons pouring into reality.
It sounds like a nightmare.
It is. And in that scenario, Exterminatus becomes a horrible but arguably necessary way to stop that threat from spreading. It's like surgical removal of a cancerous tumor, except the surgery involves cyclonic torpedoes and virus bombs.
Yeah, those are some pretty hardcore surgical tools. So we're not just talking about blowing up a planet, it's about completely sterilizing it, making sure nothing survives.
That's the grim reality of Exterminatus. And for the Imperium, sometimes sacrificing one world is seen as the only way to protect countless others. They're playing a long game, a game of survival against impossible odds.
It's a grim way to look at things, but I guess that's life in the 41st millennium. Survival at any cost. Okay, we've covered individual heretics, but what about organized heresy? Like, the fandom wiki mentioned something about heretical cults, right? What are we talking about when we say heretical cults in Warhammer 40K?
This is where things get really interesting and maybe a little too close to home.
Oh, how so?
These cults aren't just ragtag bands of rebels hiding in the shadows. They're organized, they're sophisticated, and they're incredibly dangerous. The wiki breaks them down into three main types, and what's fascinating is how their structures mirror some of the most dangerous organizations in our own history.
Hold on, you're saying these Warhammer 40K cults are like real-world terrorist groups?
In terms of their organization and tactics, there are definitely some parallels, and that's what makes them so chillingly effective. They're a constant thorn in the side of the Imperium.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about these heretical cults. What are the three main types?
Well, first you've got the charismatic cults.
Charismatic cults, I can kind of picture that.
They're often led by a single, powerful figure who inspires fanatical loyalty in their followers.
Right, like a cult leader who exerts total control over their devotees. We've seen that kind of thing in our own world, unfortunately.
Exactly. Think about the influence some historical figures have had, but amplified 1,000-fold in the warped reality of the 41st millennium.
That's a terrifying thought. What's the second type?
The second type is mystery cults and secret societies.
Mystery cults. Secret societies. Sounds intriguing.
They thrive on secrets and hierarchies. They operate in the shadows. Their true motives hidden from the Imperium. It's all very cloak and dagger.
I can see the appeal. Secrets, rituals, hidden knowledge. There's a certain allure to that, a sense of power.
But in the 41st millennium, those secrets can be incredibly dangerous. They could hold the key to summoning demons, toppling empires, you name it.
It's like a cosmic game of cat and mouse, with the Imperium trying to root out these secretive cults before they can undermine the very fabric of society. What's the third type?
The third type is perhaps the most insidious of all. Cellular cults.
Cellular cults. I haven't heard that one before.
They're decentralized, compartmentalized organizations designed for survival and efficiency. Kind of like modern terrorist cells, each cell operating independently.
That makes them incredibly difficult to track and destroy, right?
They're like a hydra. You cut off one head, two more grow back. It's a nightmare scenario for the Imperium.
It sounds like heresy is a multi-headed beast, constantly adapting and evolving to survive. No wonder the Imperium is so obsessed with rooting it out.
And that's what makes it so fascinating and so terrifying. Heresy isn't a monolithic enemy. It's a constantly shifting threat that can emerge from anywhere within the Imperium.
It's like trying to stamp out a wildfire in a hurricane. You might put out one fire, but countless others are already burning out of control.
That's a perfect analogy.
Wow, this is some heavy stuff. We've covered a lot of ground here. The definition of heresy, the punishments, these chilling, heretical cults. It's amazing how much depth and complexity there is to this one concept. It's a grim universe, that's for sure.
No kidding. But hey, that's what makes it so fascinating, right? We were talking about those heretical cults before the break.
Ah, yes, those insidious threats lurking within the Imperium itself.
Exactly, and their chilling efficiency, like mirroring some of the worst organizations in our own history.
Well, the Imperium doesn't exactly have a nuanced approach to dealing with threats.
Yeah, they're more about that hammer blow response.
Eradication rather than understanding, you could say. Purge the taint no matter the cost. Right, it all comes back to those punishments, like excommunicate traitorous, the Edict of Obliteration.
Pretty harsh, right?
No kidding. But the one that really gets me thinking is Exterminatus, wiping out a whole planet. Isn't that, I don't know, a bit excessive even for the Imperium?
It's certainly extreme, no question about that.
Yeah.
But you have to remember the scale of the threats they're facing.
Oh, right. The demons, the warp entities, those alien races that would love to see humanity wiped out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In that context, Exterminatus becomes like this terrifying emergency button.
The break glass in case of apocalypse kind of thing.
Precisely. A last resort when everything else has failed.
So it's not just about punishing heresy, it's about preventing something even worse from happening.
Exactly. Imagine a planet completely consumed by a chaos cult.
Okay, now that's a terrifying thought.
Rampant mutation, demons pouring into reality.
Yeah, I think I'd hit that Exterminatus button too.
It becomes a horrible but arguably necessary way to contain that threat.
Like cauterizing a wound, but on a planetary scale.
A rather drastic form of surgery.
So what are we talking? Cyclonic torpedoes, virus bomb.
Oh, the Imperium has a whole arsenal of planet-killing weaponry at their disposal.
Yeah.
The goal is complete sterilization, making sure absolutely nothing survives.
Grim stuff. But I guess when you're facing threats to the very survival of humanity, sometimes you gotta make tough choices.
It's a grim calculus for sure. But in the Imperium's view, sacrificing one world to save countless others, it's a price they're willing to pay.
Yeah, it's that long game thinking, right? They're playing for the survival of humanity no matter what.
Exactly. Survival at any cost.
Okay, we've talked about the punishments, but let's get down to brass tacks here. What are some concrete examples of heresy in the Warhammer 40K universe?
Well, I think the most obvious example is anything related to the Chaos Gods.
Khorne, Slanesh, Nurgle, Sinech, the big baddies.
These entities represent everything the Imperium stands against. Even whispering their names is considered a transgression.
Let alone, pledging your allegiance to them.
That's a one-way ticket to an Exterminatus party.
Yeah, so it's not just about religion, it's about loyalty. Any power that rivals the Emperor is seen as a threat.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just outright worship, too.
Oh, like what?
Imagine a tech priest messing around with forbidden Xenos technology.
Oh.
Or a psyker using their powers for personal gain instead of serving the Emperor.
Yeah, that's going to raise some eyebrows in the Inquisition.
Anything that deviates from the approved path, anything that hints at individuality or free thinking, it's all suspect.
The Imperium seems awfully obsessed with control. Control over technology, over information, even over thought itself.
Well, they're locked in a constant struggle for survival against some pretty overwhelming odds. They see any crack in their control as an invitation for chaos to seep in.
I guess when you put it that way, it makes sense, but it still feels pretty suffocating, doesn't it?
No doubt about it.
So heresy isn't just some abstract theological concept. It's any action, any belief that could potentially undermine the Imperium's power.
That's a pretty good summary. And that's what makes it so fascinating from a storytelling perspective.
It's a reflection of our own anxieties about power and control, taken to a fantastical and often terrifying extreme.
Exactly. And it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves. How much freedom are we willing to give up in the name of security? Who gets to decide what's right and what's wrong?
Big questions, man. Big questions.
And questions that the Warhammer 40K universe explores in some really interesting ways.
We've talked about what heresy is, the punishments, the cults, but I keep thinking about the individuals living in this galaxy. This constant threat of heresy hanging over their heads, it's got to take a toll, right?
Can you imagine living in a world where your neighbor could report you to the Inquisition for a whispered doubt?
Whoa, yeah, that's messed up.
Where every decision you make is weighed against the potential consequences of being labeled a heretic.
That's got to be a heavy burden to carry, like living under a totalitarian regime, always looking over your shoulder, but wouldn't that just make people more likely to rebel?
That's the tragic irony. The Imperium's methods, their obsession with control, it often creates the very conditions that lead to more heresy.
Wait, really?
It's a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and resentment. People get pushed to the extremes, forced to choose between absolute conformity and outright rebellion.
So in trying to maintain control, the Imperium might be inadvertently sowing the seeds of its own destruction.
Now that's a question worth exploring.
Definitely.
Heresy in 40K, it holds up this dark mirror to humanity.
It shows us our worst tendencies, all cranked up to 11.
And it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves. How far would we go to protect what we believe? How much freedom would we sacrifice for security?
Yeah, and who gets to decide what's heresy in the first place? Who gets to draw those lines?
Big questions,
Huge questions. Questions that hit a little too close to home sometimes.
especially when you consider the Imperium.
They might be fighting demons and aliens, but their biggest enemy could be their own rigidity.
Their obsession with control.
Like, they're so focused on stamping out heresy that they forget about the human cost.
Think about those individuals living under this oppressive regime, constantly bombarded with propaganda.
Always looking over their shoulder, afraid to even think the wrong thing.
They're taught to distrust anyone who questions the status quo.
The wiki entries really drive that point home.
Even the slightest deviation from imperial dogma can brand you a heretic.
It's not just about outward actions, it's about thought control,
Suppressing individuality.
which ironically seems to create more heresy.
Exactly. It's this self-perpetuating cycle of fear and repression.
They try to control everything, and it just backfires.
It pushes people to the extremes.
Like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
A very apt analogy.
So, is there another way? Could the Imperium survive without resorting to these brutal tactics?
That's a question for the ages.
I mean, we're not facing demons and warp storms here in the real world.
True, but that doesn't mean we're immune to the dangers of unchecked authority.
The Imperium might be fictional, but it reflects some very real human tendencies, right?
Absolutely. Throughout history, we've seen what happens when dissenting voices are silenced.
When fear and dogma are allowed to rule.
The cautionary tale, a reminder to stay vigilant, to keep asking those tough questions.
To think for ourselves.
Exactly. We can't let fear and conformity dictate our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into heresy in Warhammer 40K, I'm left with this feeling of unease.
Unease.
Like, where do we draw the line between orthodoxy and heresy? Who gets to decide?
That's the million-thrown question, isn't it? And it's something we all have to grapple with, not just in the context of a fictional universe like Warhammer 40K, but in our own lives as well.
So what are we saying? We should all just embrace chaos.
Not exactly. It's about finding that balance between order and freedom, between security and individuality.
About recognizing that there's rarely a single right answer.
And that's what makes these conversations so important.
They challenge us to think critically, to question our assumptions.
And to remember that the battle against heresy, whether it's in the 41st millennium or in our own world, is ultimately a battle for hearts and minds.
Wow, that's deep. Thanks for taking us on this journey. It's been an eye-opener, that's for sure.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, keep those cogitators turning and never be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Until next time.